Okay, can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, good. Okay, well, thanks for all those introductions. And Kev, in response to you, I don't mind being recorded, but if you can improve the way I look in any way, that would be appreciated. And maybe at the end of this 10 minutes, you'll realise you don't have to go on Twitter to see hear some vacuous nonsense. So, maybe I can help deliver on that one too. So, my name's Ali Roy, and I'm a reader in Psychosocial Research based at the University of Central Lancashire. And I trained in youth and community work at Manchester Poly in the early 90s, and it's taken me this long to get to my first youth work conference, so I'm delighted to be here. And I'm, really pleased to make some small contribution to this conference. So here's my title of my presentation: Keep on moving, using mobile methods to explore the everyday lives of young men selling sex in Manchester. And essentially, I'm going to talk about a research project that I conducted along with Jenny Hughes from the University of Manchester. Over 2 years working with the men's room. Now, some of you probably know who the men's room are, but I'm not going to assume that. So the men's room is an arts and social welfare project working with young men between the ages of 18 and 30 with a number of common experiences. It's set up specifically originally to work with young men selling sex, but now has a broader remit. And it has a number of different elements to its gender-specific provision, including creative work, including one-to-one work, but working with young male sex workers and detached work is at the heart of what the organisation is about. Yeah? And so I'm going to talk about this research project. It's kind of an exercise in cruelty asking people to talk about their research and giving them 10 minutes. So I'm going to have to be very precise about the things that I'm going to talk about, but if what I say sparks an interest, there are reports, there are papers. Any academic in the world is only too delighted to bore you with that stuff. So if what I say sparks an interest, do ask me. I'll be delighted to share some of that stuff with you or talk to you more about it. And this slide is really just by way of introducing the fact that there were a number of different elements to this research. But the one that I'm going to talk about specifically here today is the walking tour interviews. Because in a way, this method developed out of the work that we did with the men's room and seems to involve a sort of sensible response to try to understand what might be happening in an area of practice such as detached work and in working with young men, such as those who are accessing the men's room. And so what we did after about 9 months in this research is that we invited a number of young men to lead us on walking tours of the sites in Manchester that they associated with their own survival. That was a theme that they had chosen to engage in around this research. And so we walked and talked together through the city centre, and on arrival at each of the stops, we asked them to take a photograph and then, if they wanted to tell us a story related to that particular site. And there's something about walking side by side, about doing interviews in movement that changes the dynamics, and I'm sure you as detached youth work practitioners understand that perhaps better than we did originally as researchers, but it's been quite inspirational for us. Now, there are a whole load of very in-depth interviews, and I'm just going to land on one and take one tiny excerpt out of it in the context of the time that I've got available today. And this is a walking tour interview with somebody we're calling Jeff. It's not his real name. And it takes in 2 city centre sites in Manchester. One, the statue of Alan Turing. If you don't know who Alan Turing is, Google him. He's amazing. The other site is the view from the 3rd floor of a multi-storey car park, which is only a few hundred yards away. And I'm going to tell you part of what Jeff tells us at one of these sites, the statue of Alan Turing. This is part of what he says. It's where I come. Some people think I'm mad because I sit talking to him. But he gets my head straight. He don't pass judgment. That's the one thing. I used to sleep in the car park over there, and then in the daytime, I'd come and sit here and then just talk to Alan. Sometimes it was like he was the only one that listened at one point. And then just sitting here, watching things go past, you're not on your own because you've got someone sat next to you. I actually feel quite moved when I read this. I mean, I've read it many, many times. But maybe, in the context of the theme for this conference, we might take some principles of practice out of this single quote. Don't pass judgment, is how he experiences talking to a statue in comparison to a counsellor, actually, he compares it to. Getting side by side. There is something about the face-to-face that young men like these really struggle with. It's why we decided to do the interviews in this way in the first place. But actually, philosophically, the idea of getting alongside somebody is quite different from the notion of an interaction. And creating spaces in which young people can find their voice and in which we can attend to what they say rather than necessarily having to come up with a clever response. So I think just in that small quote there might be some kind of interesting principles to take out. But from this interview as a whole, what we were finding was that there's something about the concrete and metal facades of the city that seem to provide moments of relief, moments of respite, an opportunity for this young man to express difficult and overwhelming emotions in ways that didn't solicit unwelcome responses or interventions. And that seemed to be quite important for a young man who was quite phobic about reaching out to interventions from services. And in a way, for a young man who did self-identify as gay, it feels like Alan Turing's own biography and the suffering that he received as a gay man is being invoked as a sort of further avenue of support in this case. So there's much more I'd love to say about that interview and about all the others, but what I'm going to do is try and turn to, in the context of time, three things that I think that we learn from this way of working about the practices of the men's room that might in some way be relevant to the theme of this conference. And the first is something about the narratives of movement of these young men. Now, Rankin and Reagan point out that the more complex a person's needs are, the more likely they are to fall through the gaps in services that society provides. And for many of the young men who access the men's room, the demand to move on shapes their daily experience and their life history as they move in and out of care, in and out of custody, in and out of a whole number of different domestic environments, towards and away from the police, and in and out of scenes of crime, threat, and also opportunity. So this term, moving on, which is such a feature of neoliberal interventions, we might turn it round a bit and say that in the case of these young men, moving on might be a tactic of survival in a risky environment. It might be a means of eluding control. It might be an affirmation of a lack of self-worth. It might be an assertion of personal agency, as much as it could be also a step towards a positive future. And for me, the 7 walking tours that we conducted in this research provide different sort of maps created by the young men, which contain contrasting and competing and overlapping narratives of moving on, getting stuck, going backwards, as well as articulating this sort of powerful psychic need to keep on moving and a difficulty with being still. So there's something about the narratives of movement of these young men that detached work is perhaps particularly well placed to respond to. There's something about complex practices, I think, because I think the men's room's approach demonstrates a sort of what we've described as a sort of adaptive and transgressive approach to practice, in which they're trying to get alongside young men, and in which they're quite often blurring the boundaries and working at the edges, and actually that sort of blurred, transgressive approach to practice might be necessary in engaging young men like these in projects around personal change. But it's a complex approach. It's difficult work. And no matter how clear your organisational policies and procedures might be, it involves dealing with a great deal of uncertainty, not least, it seems, in the current funding climate, defending this sort of work, but actually in terms of working with the lives and realities of these young men. And so, in terms of the theme of this conference, I think there's something about beginning with recognition and moving from recognition towards a notion of moving on. And what I mean by that, I mean, Louis Sander defines the process of recognition as a moment of meeting, where one's self-gestalt meets and matches the way one is known. And I think that there's something about the work that the men's room does that provides moments of recognition in working with young men like these. And actually that's vital in beginning to engage young men who are used to operating independently, used to surviving, and are quite phobic about reaching out to services and service structures for support. But these are not predictable forms of movement. And the very popular A to B type interventions that people seem to like, commissioners seem to like to fund these days because they're easy to generate evidence about, are not the sorts of interventions that are going to work well in working with young men like these. Now, I know my 10 minutes is up, so I'm going to finish, if I may, by posing a question to the conference, and that is this. How can services work with young men's self-made maps, making the best use of what they know, and thus affirming a sense of power and agency, whilst also providing practical and realistic moments of reflection and support? I think this, for me, is a key question to wrestle with in terms of delivering this sort of work. Thanks for listening.